remember feeling incredibly small, nothing more than a distraction, right before I got up to present my research in Tokyo to a group of the world's leading cochlear implant researchers and surgeons. I'd been hoping for a poster presentation, maybe even a small PowerPoint in one of the side rooms. What I got instead was a primetime slot in the main symposium in front of 500 surgeons and professors, many of whom had been practicing for more than 30 years. I'm young as far as researchers and doctors go, but I care deeply about my team's research, which, thanks to the novel use of hydraulics, had the capacity to make a real difference to people's lives. Sitting down, waiting my turn, on my left was an Italian professor of surgery, representing a multi-million-dollar research team from Europe, complete with their very own promo guy. Across the aisle, his main competitor was a Japanese professor, esteemed and valued in the community, who was also presenting to the world for the first time a similar surgical robot. In third place was myself. Well, actually, I think third place might have been a little bit generous. I felt kind of like one of the kids who plays at halftime as entertainment, to be honest. Sitting there, awaiting my turn, with about 27 years less experience than the two professors sitting either side of me, I really wished I was doing a poster presentation. Cochlear implantation is an amazing technology. It gives an artificial sense of hearing to the deaf through a 2-centimetre bit of plastic, a little bit skinnier than a noodle. This techno noodle is implanted into the ear by a specialist ear surgeon. And whilst the results aren't quite as good as normal hearing, they're a fair bit better than nothing. We used to only implant those who were totally deaf, either those who were deafened through rotten luck or were born without their hearing organ, the cochlea, functioning quite right. But in the mid-2000s, we started to implant more and more those who had age-related hearing loss, who still had a tiny bit of not quite so useless hearing function left. Now, age-related hearing loss is a little bit different from other types of hearing loss. It tends to disproportionately affect the higher frequencies more, which is why grandparents can sometimes have a difficult time hearing their grandchildren with their squeaky voices. It's kind of funny, but it's actually a really tough thing. If there's one thing that grandparents really care about, it's their ability to communicate, in particular with their grandchildren. Now, it can still be a little bit hard for us to imagine, so let's pretend that half of us develop moderate to severe hearing loss at some point in our lives. At that level, you can't have a conversation with the person sitting next to you without one of you having to shout to make yourself heard. It's a real impediment to communication. And it's not that unlikely either, considering 50% of people over the age of 65 are affected by moderate to severe hearing loss. And for us, when we hit our 60s, those numbers will be much higher, considering growing evidence about the long-term use of headphones. Now, we do have hearing aids, and they are great. They're used for this exact reason, but they have their limitations. They're pretty difficult for old arthritic hands, and they're not very effective in those who have severe or profound hearing loss, which is quite a lot of people. Scientists started to realize that if you could preserve someone's residual hearing whilst complementing it with that of the artificial sense of hearing from a cochlear implant, the outcomes were much better, particularly for nuanced sounds like music, tone, and conversation in noisy places. The problem was we had no idea how to do this. Generally, it was taken as a given that once you put a cochlear implant into a patient, you destroyed that patient's remaining hearing. And that's because the tiny movements associated with putting an implant inside the ear are the equivalent of a jet plane taking off right next to your head. It's very loud and likely to ruin all of your remaining hearing. Now, that's where my team's research comes into play. We're looking at hearing preservation in cochlear implantation. And at this point, I have to pay tribute to my research supervisors, Professor Ganesh Rajan, Professor David Fletcher, Dr. Anand Acharya, and Miss Daisy Tavora Vieira. Without them, I simply wouldn't be standing here today. We all have our own roles in the team. My role is to work in the laboratory, coming up with new ways of trying to reduce the variation in pressure inside the cochlea during surgery. The surgery itself is incredibly intricate and tiny. It takes a very steady hand and decades of practice. It's actually not that different to the board game Operation, but it's just the stakes are slightly higher. My research was difficult because we were having problems with human variability. Namely, any variable I investigated was dwarfed in comparison to the innate human tremor, which made the use of a surgical robot an obvious choice. Now, we do have a photo here, but I must warn you, this is real science. It is scary, confronting stuff. Please don't be blown away by how awesome it is. Ready? Here we go. Yes, that is masking tape. Yes, that is blue tack there. Yes, that is a clamp from my local hardware store. Look, it was a simple handheld device which produced a slow, reproducible insertion over the course of a minute. And it was about as simple as something you'd expect to find in a box of Lego. I was shocked to find out that this device not only matched our best surgical efforts, but matched the best efforts of the leading surgeons from around the world. Not with an expensive contraption, but with a $15 Lego ripoff. We actually tested this experimentally. The very best implant surgeon in the world could only produce an insertion that was about half as good as our device with respect to variation of pressure inside the cochlea. All of a sudden, we had a device that had the capacity to take cochlear implantation into the next phase for the price of 3 overpriced coffees. So we took this idea to Japan. Now, I'll be honest, I felt like a total fraud. I was presenting on novel, developing ideas, and I was the first of 3 surgical robots to be presented to the world for the first time that day. Surgical robots aren't even that common, even at a surgical conference, so the odds were pretty small. In any case, I got up on the day, I made my presentation. The only speaker, not a professor. The only research team not backed by millions of dollars of research funding. I said my bit, I answered a few polite questions, and I sat back down. And it wasn't until after the presentation that I started to realize that we might have something of real value here. People were coming up to us and asking us all sorts of questions. Have you commercialized the device yet? Is the intellectual property for sale? Have you tested this in humans? I was blown away that a device so simple could be held in such high regard by the scientific community. Even now, we're in conversation with companies overseas looking to develop our ideas to incorporate into widespread models. I'd been so focused on my age, inexperience, and the relative simplicity of my research that I hadn't thought about its value to the wider community. Now, I'm not pretending to be the next great researcher or surgeon out there. I'm just trying to be a good one right now. But I think the real lesson in this is that great ideas don't have to be complex ones, and they don't have to come from someone with years of experience. On that stage in Tokyo, I was so focused on what I wasn't that I forgot about what I was. I was young, inexperienced, but I was coming at the problem from a fresh angle. And I had an idea that had the capacity to help millions of people. If you've got a problem and you're passionate about fixing it, that's all that matters. Thank you.